Well, I think we can start now. It's about 10:05 and most people have joined who are about to join us. Great. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. A very good morning to you all from Boston. Welcome to the Decolonization-in-Progress seminar. And this is our second session this fall semester. So welcome to all. I'm your host and moderator, Jayita Sarkar. I'm an assistant professor here at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, and I am the director of the Global Decolonization Initiative that is hosting this event. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Dr. Elisabeth Leake for her newest book, The Afghan Crucible, Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan. That's going to be published in a few months by Oxford University Press in April 2022. We are excited to have a superb discussant, Dr. Rob Rakove, who is joining us from California. And the sun has not really risen there. So thank you, Rob. Before I proceed any further, I just wanted to remind all the attendees, we are recording this meeting. So if you do not wish to be recorded, turn off your audio and video functions. The same applies for Q&A. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can send the question in chat to everyone, and the author, the discussant, or me, somebody will get to you and flag that question to the panelists, and we'll get to your question. So let me begin by quick introductions so we can get to the heart of the matter, and that's the book talk and the discussion. Our author is the fantastic Dr. Elisabeth Leake, who is Associate Professor of International History at the University of Leeds, trained as a historian at Yale University and Cambridge. Her expertise is in 20th century international history, 20th century South Asia, decolonization, global Cold War, borderlands, and US foreign policy. Her first book, The Defiant Border, The Afghan-Pakistan Borderlands in the Era of Decolonization, 1936 to 1965, was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. And we are here today for her second book, The Afghan Crucible, The Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan, to be published by Oxford University Press in April 2022. Our discussant, who I think needs no introduction given the audience we have, is Dr. Rob Rakove. He's a historian at Stanford University who studies US foreign relations, focusing on the Cold War. He's the author of Kennedy, Johnson, and the Not-Aligned World, published in 2012 by Cambridge University Press. And he is presently at work on a study of the US-Afghan relationship in the Cold War before the Soviet invasion. So with that, I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Leake and Dr. Rakove, and welcome to all our attendees. Dr. Leake, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, Jay, thank you so much for your kind invitation. And Rob, thank you so much as well for offering to comment. This is really exciting for me. I should say, as a way of precedent, this is kind of one of the first times I'm really trying to sort of tackle talking about the book writ large. So hopefully things go to plan, and it gives you a bit of a flavor of the book overall, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to try to share my screen. I've got a couple of slides, so let me see if I can get that to work. I should also say, in a word, I'm sure you'll see me fumbling at some stage, unlike for Rob, where I think the sun is just rising. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon here in the UK, so the sun is already setting. So I'll probably need to turn some more lights on at some stage. But right, let me see if this works. Brilliant. Jay, is that visible? Okay. Brilliant. So yeah, so again, so today I'm going to be trying to kind of talk about and give a little bit of a flavor to my forthcoming book, Afghan Crucible, The Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which took place starting in December 1979, I think has been really largely understood and often written about in the context of the Cold War. So in that context, certainly Afghanistan in the 1980s was what we could perhaps say one of the Cold War's killing fields. So it was a battlefield in the worldwide superpower competition between the United States and Soviet Union that devolved into widespread and, of course, life-shattering violence. So, of course, then from this vantage point, the Soviet invasion was not atypical. It sat alongside superpower interventions across the world in the 20th century. So running from Guatemala and the Dominican Republic through to Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Iran and Lebanon, the Philippines, Indonesia, Korea, and of course, and has been mentioned, I think, quite frequently of late, Vietnam. So the Afghan Civil War then and events in the 1980s certainly then demonstrated how the Cold War shaped the Third World, and certainly not only as an event co-opted by the superpowers. So the war was a conflict that influenced the United States and the Soviet Union's own trajectories and had lingering effects across Asia and the Middle East. But while the superpower-led Cold War was certainly pervasive, I think one of the things I'm particularly keen to emphasize is that it was not the only story taking place. And I should say perhaps in that sort of respect, the title of the book is perhaps slightly misleading in terms of the real focus on the Soviet invasion, but the marketing choices at OUP rather than my own. But what I should say this project is really attempting to do is to write a global history of the Afghan Civil War of the 1980s. So in fact, the book really starts before the December 1979 Soviet invasion. One of the most obvious, I suppose, starting points of the book would be the April 1978 coup that brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Afghan Socialists, to power. But the book also roots events in the 1980s and Afghanistan's longer 20th century history. So the Soviet invasion, in that respect, was entangled with regional power competitions, including the Sino-Soviet split and Indo-Pakistan hostilities. It spurred on alternative visions of internationalism that rejected US or Soviet domination, but nevertheless drew on a shared tactical playbook. And it forced Afghan actors into competition with international organization while Afghans' daily lives were under scrutiny by local Afghan and global forces alike. So in that respect, then, the war was as much about territory, ethnicity, and community as it was about global alliances, political aspirations, and the nature of state power. So scholars thus far have compared the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with other Cold War crises in order to demonstrate the conflict's global and violent nature. So in Afghan Crucible, I take a different approach. Instead, what the book does is to examine effectively a single conflict through the multiple perspectives of many of the local, regional, and international actors who took part. So in other words, it's a multi-scalar, multi-locational approach. I've included on this slide the table of contents of the book, and hopefully what it sort of demonstrates is that each chapter, in effect, offers a different lens of analysis. So each chapter examines a particular group of historical actors, often based in a specific geographical locations, and then delves into the ways in which they approach the conflict. So the book then moves between Kabul, Moscow, Islamabad, Peshawar and the Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan, Washington, D.C., the refugee camps along Pakistan's northwest frontier province in Baluchistan. So Nazirbagh was one of the biggest refugee camps to emerge in the 1980s and was in fact only closed in 2002. So it had this really lingering history. And then finally, the book ends in Geneva with the discussion of the UN-led negotiations that led to the Geneva Accords through which Soviet troops withdrew. So correspondingly then with this structure, so we examine in turn the PDPA, the Afghan Socialists. We look at the Kremlin and Soviet Politburo, as well as Soviet state builders on the ground in Afghanistan. The book explores the role of regional state leaders headed by Pakistan, but also including Iran, India, and China. It explores the actions and activities of the Afghan resistance parties and the mobilization of many Afghan different kind of political and social groups against the Afghan Socialists and their Soviet backers, before looking then at the Carter and Reagan administrations and the key role played by the Central Intelligence Agency, the role of UNHCR officials and their activities amongst the Afghan refugees, and then finally the role of the UN General Assembly and the UN officials who were tasked with negotiating a Soviet withdrawal. So collectively, what I hope this does is to demonstrate that this alternative form of comparison really highlights, certainly on one hand, the pervasiveness of the Cold War, but also then really draws attention to the ways that the Cold War intersected with decolonization, the rise of international organizations, and alternative ideologies that drove local actors. So this book, I hope, allows us then kind of methodologically to peel back and try to disentangle the layers of global, regional, and local engagement with Afghan politics and society, and I hope at least reveal with far greater nuance the numerous, frequently competing, yet often interconnected motives that drove different actors who became involved in the crisis. Just to say a couple of words about kind of how the project came to fruition, and I guess kind of to think about what were the sources of this project. So as an event that brought in so many historical actors from across the world, the Afghan Civil War of the 1980s has left a correspondingly global paper trail, though I hasten to add, not necessarily an even one. So the actors involved in Afghanistan have left behind materials that vary in their depth, their focus, as well as their accessibility. So the United Nations and the High Commission for Refugees, for example, which were both so involved with Afghan refugees and the refugee camps, the negotiations that led to the Soviet withdrawal, and were also sort of key units to whom different Afghan interest groups turned to in their quest for international legitimation, have provided particularly rich materials. Likewise, I think unsurprisingly, the Reagan and Carter administrations left large amounts of reporting and data. I suppose in contrast to that, I largely followed the Soviet Union's state building initiatives within Afghanistan, which were revealed at the State Archive of the Russian Federation, rather than focusing as strictly on top-level decision-making in Moscow, the papers for which remain largely classified. In exploring the regional ramifications of the Civil War, I've depended heavily on newspapers, publicly available government statements, and memoirs rather than state archives. So much of the material from regional actors remains classified or is also often very difficult to access. And I should say, certainly experience researching my first book demonstrated, in particular, that materials gained in Pakistani archives could equally be very swiftly taken away. So in all of these different sources, Afghan voices and perspectives can be found. So both the Afghan Socialists and Resistance Party leaders corresponded with foreign officials, they lobbied the international community, or they engaged in regional debates. Likewise, they translated their manifestos into numerous languages, as I'll be kind of describing in a little bit. So certainly then as well, many paper sources from before and during the Civil War were destroyed in the course of fighting in Kabul in the 1990s, but other Afghan materials have been made available to scholars worldwide through various digital collaborations, and they're a really fantastic resource. So one thing though I really want to emphasize though with this project is firstly, I was unable to travel to Afghanistan in preparing this book for various reasons. And likewise, other constraints led me to prioritize learning and using Russian over Pashto or Dari. These choices then have inevitably shaped what I've written, which is a point that I'm really keen to emphasize. So I cannot, and this book does not represent an Afghan perspective on the conflict. So I seek to explore and to contextualize Afghan decision-making in ways in which large swaths of the country's population responded hostilely to communist government reforms. But I do really try not to make assertions about how or why individual Afghans responded to socialist, Islamist, or other visions of modernity in different ways. So in other words, I'm really keen to emphasize that this book cannot serve as an on-the-ground history of the Soviet invasion, but rather instead tries to tease out the messy interconnections between the local, the national, the regional, and the global. So then in that sense, what does the book do? So I'd say kind of overall, kind of thinking about kind of what are some of the major themes of the book are, I think I really look at three things. So I look at kind of ideas and different ideologies that became really central within the conflict. I look at the ways that these ideas were implemented often in terms of policy, but also kind of different political and social movements. And then finally, I look at the consequences, both intended and unintended, of these ideas and their implementation. So just to delve into some of the examples then that I kind of explore in much greater depth in the book. So first, I look at the ideas that drove decision-making. So starting in the early to mid 20th century, I traced how the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan adopted Marxism-Leninism, and how likewise students and staff at Kabul University also turned to political Islam, drawing particularly on links with Al-Azhar University in Cairo and intellectual linkages with the Muslim Brotherhood. So an early chapter sort of traces out the longer kind of genealogies of these ideas and how Kabul University in particular served as a really key setting in which these kind of political debates took place. So I look at some of the intellectual linkages between the Afghan Islamists who really rose to the fore in the 1980s and their ties with thinkers such as Abdullah Maududi and Syed Qutb. And then later chapters explore the further development of these Afghan Islamist ideas and visions of governance in the context of the Afghan socialist coup and the subsequent civil war. So I thought one of the examples I would give from the book today is that about kind of surrounding some of the questions to do with the Afghan Islamists. The reason I do this is kind of a several-fold, as I hope will become clear. So Afghan Islamist politics and political thought first came up against the Afghan government in 1975. So it has this longer genealogy, when a number of Islamist individuals and groups tried to mobilize a rebellion against Afghanistan's president, Mohammed Khan. This rebellion failed. And in turn, that caused many of the Afghan Islamist leaders to flee to Pakistan. Excuse me. So it was really in and around Peshawar in the 1970s that these groups began to organize. So I discussed then, in that sense, the diverse ways in kind of across the book and the ways in which resistance to the Afghan socialists and their Soviet backers unfolded. But I particularly focus on kind of the longer histories and trajectories of two particular organizations and resistance parties. So Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hizb-i-Islami and Burhanuddin Rabbani's Jamiat-e-Islami. So these are two kind of the main political organizations that really come to the fore in the 1980s. And the reason I just really decided to focus on these two parties or organizations in particular was really threefold. Firstly, these two organizations are part of this longer history of kind of Afghan Islamist political thought and mobilization, particularly from the mid-1960s in this sort of social milieu of Kabul University. Leaders in both of these organizations are very active in the 1975 attempted rebellion against the Afghan government. And they also then are also very early on then end up in and around Peshawar in exile. And it's really kind of then from this exile kind of source and base of exile politics that they're able to position themselves as two of the leading groups, to pivoting themselves against the PDPA, the Afghan Socialists, when the Socialists come to power in April 1978. One of the other reasons then that I focus on these two parties, and this is sort of mirrored in the images which you can see on the screen, is because they offer a really interesting source of comparison for thinking about Afghan Islamist governments and the different forms that it might take. So what you can see on the screen then are their charters, which, as you can see, they translated into English and published in Afghan Jihad, one of the resistance publications that circulated worldwide. And what's particularly interesting with these charters is, firstly, they demonstrate the radically modernist ambitions of these groups. So Hizb-i-Islami and Jamiat envision two really interesting but starkly different visions of what Afghanistan's political future could look like. So Hizb-i-Islami was very focused on single party rule. It took a very strict line about the relationship between religion and politics in terms of thinking about Afghanistan's political future. Jamiat took a slightly more, I suppose, more accommodating perspective in terms of envisioning a multi-party state. But what's also really interesting is thinking about kind of the ways in which Hizb-i-Islami or Jamiat, in having these very modern ambitions, also frame kind of the more universalist terms of what they hoped to bring to Afghanistan and what they hope to kind of bring out of the civil war. So Hizb-i-Islami actually very interestingly shared with the Afghan Socialists pledges to undertake land reform, which is really interesting given that land reform was one of the kind of key sources of tensions that actually led to widespread resistance against the Afghan Socialists starting in 1978 and 1979. And likewise, I think what these manifestos and charters also demonstrate is certainly as well the significance of party structures as a source of mobilization, and thus also then in terms of differentiating this war from earlier regime changes. So in that sense, kind of one of the reasons I focus on these parties then in this book is to really emphasize the very political nature of the war as well, and the very modernist ambitions and the very modern stakes that took place within the confines of the Civil War. Finally, because these groups were particularly well organized, and because they found favor with Pakistan's inner services intelligence, they became then two of the leading resistance groups. And this in turn then helped to feed into a growing political binary, I guess, across Afghanistan and within Afghanistan and between as well their international backers, through which kind of politics increasingly became defined as a divide between socialist visions of Afghanistan on one hand and Islamist on the other. So this growing binary in consequence also left far less room than for more moderate or secular reformers to also take part in terms of negotiating the potential political future of Afghanistan in a post-Soviet withdrawal world. So in that sense, then in terms of thinking about ideas, I think an ideology, the book then really explores some of the different ideas that drove Afghan resistance groups, as well as the Afghan Socialists and their international backers. But I also then demonstrate how foreign actors did not necessarily recognize the ambitious nature of this politics. So I also then in turn, for example, examine how American analysts, officials, and diplomats, rather than recognizing these very modern political ambitions of different Afghan resistance groups, instead adopted older British colonial rhetoric that continued to focus on Afghans as tribal, backwards, and resistant to change. So I think it's very well established in the literature. I mean, in terms of thinking about kind of the British imperial encounter with Afghanistan, and the ways that the tribe as a socio-political unit became really key in terms of the framing of Afghan politics, Afghan statehood, and the British colonial Afghan encounter. And of course, too, in the ways that British colonial officials use the term tribe, it also gained increasingly civilizational overtones. And particularly with this assumption that tribes were inherently backwards and incapable, I suppose, of modernization in the same ways as other socio-political groups or other kind of social forms. So what's particularly interesting, though, is that both before, during, and after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, CIA analysts, State Department officials, members of the NSC, and embassy officials also continued to use these tropes in order to explain what was going on in Afghan politics and society. So for example, Theodore Eliot, who was the American ambassador in Kabul at the time of the April 1978 coup, he compared Afghanistan's erstwhile leader, Muhammad Daud Khan, to the Lakota chieftain Sitting Bull. And he went on to then to refer to Afghanistan as Daud's so-called larger tribe. As you can see then from the quote on the screen, as late as 1986, CIA analysts were very insistent that resistance in Afghanistan to the PDPA, to the Afghan Socialists and the Soviet backers, consisted almost entirely of traditional leaders with their own tribal objectives who refused to fight outside their tribal regions. And you can really see this with this quote and kind of the continuing use of the words tribal and traditional, non-tribal versus tribal. And in this sense, too, it kind of demonstrates a really, I suppose, really clear sense of contrast and a really clear sense of distinction in the ways that certainly many American officials were framing the war in Afghanistan, particularly compared to the political manifestos of the resistance parties, right? So in this sense, too, we see a real tension in ideas and a real contrast in ideas about the war in Afghanistan emerging. Likewise, as well, the book, I point out in the book that officials across American political departments as well largely dismissed Islam as a potential political force across the region. Instead, they argued that Islam could not, and I quote, could not contain the anger and frustration of the Muslim people uprooted from their traditional milieu. So instead, again, instead of the kind of very modernist framing of Islamist politics, religion was very much dismissed by many American officials as a force for political change. So of course, then with the power of retrospect, we can obviously then see the long-term consequences of this limited view of both the Afghan resistance as well as political Islam more broadly. And so these are some of the ways in which I kind of examine, I guess, ideas or lack of ideas is really, really key to this conflict. So secondly, then I look at some of the ways in which these ideas were implemented. So with the Soviets and kind of Soviet visions of Afghanistan, I particularly explore how the Permanent Intergovernmental Commission on Economic Cooperation was tasked with enacting the mandates of the Kremlin. So translating professions of Soviet-Afghan friendship into road and school building, developing laboratories and other institutions, translating pamphlets, and effectively trying to create a functioning Afghan economy. On the other side of Afghanistan, I explore how General Zia-ul-Haq's focus on Islamization and Pakistani national security, in contrast, translated into support for these Afghan resistance groups, and particularly then Hizb Islami and other Islamist organizations, particularly because Zia sought to restrict the influences of Pashtun ethno-nationalism within Pakistan, as well as to put sympathetic new Afghan rulers into power next door. I guess more locally then too, in terms of thinking about the relationship between ideas and policy, I look at refugee camps then as a site of convergence and conflict for different ideas around rights, humanitarianism, and also competing notions of social and political order. So on one hand, the camps certainly reflected the longer history of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and their historical attempts to alleviate human suffering. So these sites in and of themselves, the refugee camps, were rooted in older histories of Western humanitarian intervention, as well as attempts to impose order and organization onto forced migrants. But likewise, the refugee camps also became sites that the government of Pakistan and resistance groups became heavily and actively involved in order to take advantage of and to reshape Afghan society and politics. So the refugee camps became a site of competition between the UNHCR and Afghan resistance parties in particular. And as you can see with the political cartoon on the right, Afghan resistance groups proved particularly adept at adopting the language of humanitarian crisis in order to insert themselves as intermediaries between UNHCR officials on one hand and Afghan refugees on the other. And so in that sense too, kind of seeing the refugee camps really provided kind of this clash then between these kind of different ideas around kind of social and political orders. So third then and finally, I explore some of the consequences, both intended and unintended, of this decision-making that took place, whether in Kabul or Islamabad, Geneva or Peshawar. So I then look at the regional alliances and political impetuses that I mentioned ultimately brought the Afghan Islamists to the fore over more moderate or secular resistance groups. And I also then examined the forced migration of millions of Afghan civilians in response to Afghan socialist reforms, as well as the spreading civil war, right? So it's always, I think, so important to remember, if we think about the Afghan War of the 1980s, it created one of the biggest refugee crises of the modern world. I also explored then the ultimate disconnect between the United Nations led decision-making in Geneva and matters on the ground. So of course, in one of the kind of fundamental ironies and tragedies, the top-down negotiated Geneva Accords, through which the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw troops by February 1989, of course, did not stop fighting across Afghanistan. And political agreements pledging to respect Afghan self-determination, however, failed to create processes or spaces through which Afghan wishes could actually be ascertained. So if we think about some of the different groups who were involved in the UN-led negotiations, we see those as state leaders, so the government of Pakistan, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan as Afghanistan's official state representatives, the Soviet Union, and the United States. In contrast then, the Afghan resistance parties were excluded from the UN-led political negotiations because they were framed as non-state actors. As such, then, the Geneva Accords were not particularly representative. And I guess taking a step outward, this has really uncomfortable parallels then with the peace talks that took place in Doha, particularly in 2020 and early 2021, where again, not all Afghan interest groups were represented or able to participate. Finally, then, in terms of thinking about kind of the long-term consequences of the Civil War, certainly the book then really thinks about and reflects on the ways that violence, the key role of violence, right? And kind of not only in terms of militarized violence, but also systemic violence, and the way that it became so pervasive and systematized with really long-term ramifications for Afghans and the global international order. So this is just to give a little bit of a taste, a kind of a slightly scattered taste of some of the things that I talk about in the book. But so what I really hope is that taking this multi-scalar, multi-locational approach really demonstrates, and what becomes most immediately obvious is that the Afghan crisis was deeply messy. So the Afghan Civil War attracted interests and actors from across the world. So Soviet and American policymakers, officials from the UN and other international organizations, leaders from states such as Pakistan, Iran, India, and China, NGOs from across Europe and North America, and resistance fighters from across the Muslim world all converged in Afghanistan because the conflict posed a litmus test for the international order as well as for Afghanistan. So the late 1970s were this unique moment when Cold War détente was evaporating, political Islam was emerging as a very potent force, and crises of state leadership were really rampant, particularly across this region. So an uneasy status quo existed in international relations that quickly tipped into chaos thanks to events in Afghanistan, Iran, and elsewhere. Likewise, though, this was a moment then where a socialist or Islamist Afghanistan seemed like a viable political option for Afghanistan's future. And this then links to the final point I want to emphasize today, is that in terms of thinking about the ways that we must recognize Afghans as global actors. So one thing I'm really keen to emphasize in this book is that Afghanistan in the 1980s was not just a site of foreign intervention. And instead, I explore the ways that Afghan elites and intellectuals drove the conflict in numerous ways. So in terms of thinking about kind of the global nature of the story, it's important for us to remember that, of course, across preceding decades and centuries, Afghanistan's economy had been rooted in trade links expanning north, south, east, and west. Its intelligentsia shared histories and practices of poetry, literature, and language that spanned South Asia and the Middle East. Afghan leaders had joined the 1955 Afro-Asia Conference in Bandung to express racial solidarity and reject Cold War binaries, and they helped found the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961. Afghan intellectuals had received educations across South Asia, the Middle East, and further abroad in Europe, North America, and the Soviet Union. And like their counterparts across the decolonizing world, they too turned to the promises of liberalism, constitutionalism, socialism, and Islamism as different potential modes for shaping their country's future and the international system. So in that regard, then in the 1980s, educated Afghans, both within and outside the ruling elite, really drove many of the conversations about Afghanistan's political future, largely because they positioned themselves as global actors who were taking part in universalist debates about politics, the social contract, and international relations. So in that sense, Afghan elites' visions of modernity that came to the fore in the Afghan resistance groups, that came to the fore within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, as well as within other organizations, emerged then in part from exchanges with external sources, but they also looked to develop models that fit Afghanistan's local circumstances and that also had the potential to be exported abroad. So to give just one example then of this kind of very globalized nature of the conflict and this globalized outlook, we can turn very briefly to the English language publications of the Afghan resistance groups, through which, in all effect, they basically ran a public diplomacy campaign. So Jamiat Islami and Hizbi Islami, for example, opened their own offices in London and Los Angeles, and they circulated across the world various English, Arabic, Dari, and Pashto language newspapers and journals. So among these were those that you can see on board, so Jamiat's Mirror of Jihad and Hizbi Islami's Mujahideen Monthly. And party leaders used these publications to great effect to demonstrate the global significance of the war in Afghanistan, cultivate further support, and begin discussing different models of Islamic political organization. So what's really interesting is the ways in which they explain their political goals in terms recognizable to many foreign audiences. So Hizbi Islami, for example, demanded an independent and non-aligned Afghanistan that would be self-sufficient and pledged that there would be good relations with the international community. I should also say Hekmatyar, sort of ironically, given his very ready use of violence, also pledged to respect human rights. Likewise, Jamiat pledged to uphold peaceful coexistence and Afghan self-determination. And both parties drew broader parallels as well. So one Jamiat representative pointedly told a seminar of senior policymakers in Washington, D.C., and I quote, "If we fail, no small country in the world can feel safe, and world peace will become even more fragile." So I think these publications are particularly interesting for the ways, for the ways that resistance parties use them to position themselves. So what these leaders made clear was that the goals of the Islamist parties were those of the world community: political independence, peaceful international relations. Yet they were also tailored then through the prism of political Islam for what these party leaders perceived to be Afghanistan's political, social, as well as spiritual needs. I think then to kind of further illustrate that, we can, I guess, use one of this political cartoon, which is, I think, just a really fascinating image. And of course, so again, this was another Afghan Islamist political cartoon that circulated, and it's very clearly inspired by the famous photograph of American Marines during the Second World War raising Old Glory at the Battle of Iwo Jima. And so again, in terms of using this cartoon, it really demonstrates the ways in which these different Afghan elites and intellectuals were very much in conversation with these more kind of these global trends or ideas. The fact that they were drawing these very obvious, I guess, international parallels as well, in order to sort of frame what they were trying to achieve in the war in Afghanistan. So this was not just a war against the Afghan socialists and against their Soviet backers. It was also a war to put in place a completely different vision of Afghan politics and society. So in that sense, tracing these sorts of networks that linked Afghans' aspirations to a broader global context thus helps to shed light into some of the myriad ways that educated Afghans, as well as intellectuals across the world, understood and aspired to certain forms of national and international politics. In that sense, I do hope that the book also helps to provide a corrective to some of the ideas put forward, particularly that the traditionalism and localism of Afghanistan are not survivals of ancient traditions, but rather the result of the country's forced integration into the contemporary state system. So in other words, I'm really hoping with this book to kind of question some of these narratives of Afghan exceptionalism and of course, the very tired trope of graveyard of empires. I think what becomes really clear from these sources is that Afghan intellectuals and leaders certainly did not see themselves as citizens of a state forced unwillingly or inappropriately into an international state system. Instead, for Afghans and many of their allies across South Asia and the Middle East, Afghanistan was, and to use the framing of historian Faiz Ahmed, an ideal conduit through which an assortment of radical political coalitions could take shape and did take shape. So Afghanistan, by shedding imperial oversight in 1919, taking the lead in pan-Asian and pan-Islamic anti-colonial networks, and working to establish a stable government rooted in constitutionalism, and or socialism, Islamism offered in many ways actually the prototype for the post-colonial state. And thus, Afghan reformers really sought the vague but potent promise of modernity. So they sought to reaffirm, but also to reform a form of statehood that married aspects of Western liberalism with Islamic and indigenous practices, while simultaneously embracing participation in global governance. In this regard, then, I suppose, to kind of flip this idea of Afghan exceptionalism on its head, we could say that Afghanistan's exceptionalism derived from the possibilities it presented as a model, not from the West's limited circumscription of what a state should look like. So in this sense, then, examining the different interest groups that became involved in the Afghan Civil War provides an opportunity to reflect on the global moment of the late 1970s and 1980s. So this was a time then when global governance was simultaneously expanding and constricting. So few certainly doubted the UNHCR's worldwide remit to alleviate the suffering of refugees. And of course, the UN General Assembly represented a key arena of international affairs. But as this conflict in particular demonstrated, the UN still wrestled with the contradiction of trying to uphold an international state system whose members overwhelmingly rejected the legitimacy of one state's leader, the Afghan Socialists, while refusing still to extend recognition to any alternative state claimants, whether the Islamists or other resistance parties. So in that sense, I think the book sort of begs a question about whether this was a moment that revealed as well the limitation of the international system, not just of Afghan visionaries. So in that sense, the Afghanistan of the 1980s that I hope comes through in this book was a place of potentials. So Afghan modernizers' ideas and aspirations in that sense mattered, and they reflected a time and place where it seemed possible that either side could succeed in fundamentally reshaping Afghanistan. Of course, though, the civil war between the two sides did fundamentally change Afghanistan, but not in ways that any of the groups involved hoped for. So exploring then how different actors inside and outside Afghanistan responded to the April 1978 coup and the subsequent Soviet invasion reveals perhaps then why none of these visions of Afghan modernity ultimately came to pass. So the Afghan crisis then of the 1980s really derived from both politics and interests that were born in multiple locations, and collectively they were just irreconcilable. But of course, it's many of those tensions then that continue, I suppose, to reverberate and influence on not only Afghanistan, but kind of, I guess, the realm of international politics to this day. We'll go ahead and stop there.
All right, that is excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Leake. Dr. Rakove.
Thank you. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to offer an early commentary on my friend and colleague Elizabeth's groundbreaking second book, Afghan Crucible, and I'd very much like to thank Jayita for the invitation to address the decolonization seminar. As she noted, I'm at work on my own project, a history of US-Afghan relations up to 1979. That's my vantage point. I am hoping that the manuscript that I'm presently working on will hit print within maybe a couple of years. And perhaps at that happy point, I'll have the opportunity to address the seminar again. For now, it suffices to note that Afghan Crucible grapples very fruitfully with many of the same questions that presently confront me. Historians approaching Afghanistan from whatever perspective, mine, Elizabeth's, others, wage what I think is a dual struggle. On the one hand, they confront a country that remains relatively understudied for key stretches of its history. The historian Niall Green laments a dearth of works considering the period between 1929 and 1979. He describes that half century as the missing middle of Afghan history. Somewhere in this interval, even as Afghanistan largely evaded enlistment in a world war, and then up until the late 70s, the Cold War, as it expanded its diplomatic horizons, as it successfully elicited aid and technical advice from both blocs, the project of Afghan state building came calamitously undone. Profound and dispiriting gaps in the evidentiary record, which Elizabeth described, and at times outright redaction and classification make the study of modern Afghanistan a difficult task. Were that not enough, historians face also a relentless public discourse shaped by decades of warfare, marred by cliches, catchphrases, and conspiracy theories. Years ago, our friend and colleague, Timothy Noonan, who I'm pleased to see is in attendance, observed that rebuffing the graveyard of empires trope has also itself become cliche. Undoubtedly so, but we still find ourselves having to do it as each new wave of commentary appears to revive it, erasing the variety and the vibrancy of Afghanistan's past and consigning it to a dismal, unchanging future. Afghan Crucible is a powerful corrective to such treatments and an exceptional addition to historical scholarship on the late 20th century. It chronicles the point of rupture in Afghan history, the country's descent into a civil war freighted with regional and global implications. Moving adroitly to depict an array of Afghan and foreign actors, it establishes three core interrelated themes, which I would note are actually somewhat different from the ones Elizabeth enunciated, but I'll just run with them. The contingency of Afghan history, the ambitions of Afghan and foreign actors, and contrary to the graveyard trope, the non-exceptional nature of Afghanistan. And these will just sort of bob and weave in my commentary. They're difficult for me to disaggregate. A sense of contingency emerges in Elizabeth's opening chapter, which opens in the Afghanistan of 1965 on the campus of newly constructed Kabul University in the wake of the country's first national elections. The setting and its description are likely to startle many, perhaps most readers of the book. Pre-crisis Afghan politics were, as she puts it, diverse, yet fundamentally forward-looking, fertilized by transnational currents, diplomatic connections, and the travels of a small but influential core of Afghan students and professionals. It is a picture that is more poignant than it is ominous, even as she notes that Kabul University housed the future leadership of Afghanistan's Marxist and Islamist parties. One of the capital's frequent earthquakes, timed and situated differently, could have changed history. The depiction is evocative, serving to draw Afghanistan closer to us. Her frequent, concise discussion of Afghanistan's wider region, meanwhile, serves to illuminate a broader wave of upheaval in the mid to late 1970s. The political crisis that beset Afghanistan in that era was anything but an isolated event, alongside Indira Gandhi's emergency, the post-Mao scramble for power in China, the overthrow of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan, and of course, the Iranian Revolution. Against this backdrop, turmoil in Kabul is scarcely extraordinary. The difference, according to her argument, is one of timing and of circumstance. The Marxist victors of the April 1978 coup, who had themselves barely survived a preemptive wave of arrests by the government of Mohammad Daoud Khan, were themselves ill-prepared to exercise power. Numerous other parties were ill-disposed to wait for them. Brief, counterfactual interjections by the author serve a very valuable purpose. If some degree of civil conflict was to be expected in Afghanistan, it was hardly foreordained that its neighbors would each be inclined for their own reasons to support Islamist parties, or that a change of regime in Kabul would occur amid a dramatic unraveling of the US-Soviet détente regime, mere weeks after, I might throw in, a bizarre US-Soviet dispute over the presence of a combat brigade in Cuba. Afghanistan's neighbors in the United States discerned both risk and opportunity in the unfolding struggle. More important than any innate Afghan conditions, in other words, were the choices of these other parties, each determined to make Afghanistan the proving ground of one doctrine or another. No one actor or coalition could claim preponderant power in the ensuing struggle. Each, however, enjoyed something akin to a veto over the attainment of other agendas. In concise, compelling, broadly researched chapters, Elizabeth introduces us to the various external parties who turned the Afghan Civil War into something both locally destructive and globally significant, perhaps in the manner that Spain was rendered such in the 1930s. This polycentric approach is not new to her. Her earlier book, featured here, The Defiant Border, analyzes the stakes ascribed to Pakistan's northwest frontier provinces across 3 decades from the vantage point of policymakers in Britain, the United States, Afghanistan, and British India, as well as its successor states. In Afghan Crucible, the scope widens further, taking the reader from Kabul to Islamabad, Moscow, and Geneva, with concise treatment of decisions in Tehran, New Delhi, and Beijing as well. Ambition, rather than desperation, defines this account. Elizabeth challenges us with her early declaration that the Afghanistan of the 1980s was a place of potentials. Although it is a study of war, Afghan Crucible focuses on acts of creation and does so in conscious rebuke of earlier works. Elizabeth wryly detects a morbid fascination, her words, with battlefield events in much of the existing historical literature. Central to this account is a nuanced, but not exculpatory, examination of the much maligned PDPA. A party of contradictions, in her words, the PDPA was racked by vicious infighting and yet somehow managed to survive in power for 14 years. Its 1978 reform program was ambitious, but actually departed little from the promises made earlier by Daoud. Provocatively, Elizabeth suggests that little distinguished the PDPA's land reform policy from that pursued by other governing parties in the post-colonial world, Marxist or otherwise. Profound ignorance of the Afghan countryside and a lack of administrative capacity undermined the PDPA, as did, of course, its frequent reliance on mass violence. Yet by her account, it also proved surprisingly adaptable, even as, of course, the Red Army acted as its principal bulwark. More than one recent analysis has contrasted its post-89 endurance in Kabul favorably to that of Ashraf Ghani's government. Surprising and imitative similarities also link the Afghan Marxists with their Islamist nemesis, as Elizabeth noted in her remarks. Both factions came of political age on the campus of Kabul University in the 1960s and the 1970s. Both faced repression after Daoud's coup in 1973 and adopted the tactics of revolutionary struggle. The Islamists notably developed extensive party programs, often in competition with each other as their tenuous alliances fractured. Internecine conflict between the parties sapped the Afghan resistance, but also bolstered the ambitions like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud, prodding each to elucidate his vision of the Afghan future while cultivating patrons outside of the country. Hekmatyar's Hizb-i Islami promised Afghan laborers a better standard of living. Massoud undertook ambitious efforts to organize civil society in the Panjshir Valley. This wartime competition between parties, which was at times as vicious as their struggle against the communists, seeded further violence after the fall of the PDPA. Foreign actors launched their own Afghan enterprises, meanwhile. One of the distinct contributions of this book is its study of Soviet state building under fire, which complements earlier works by Tim, by Bob Cruz, by Paul Robinson, and Jay Dixon. Considering the wariness with which the Kremlin viewed Afghanistan, the extent of its state-building efforts is startling. Elizabeth's sensible conclusion is that the Soviets simply did not know what else to do and fell back upon an established socialist playbook. Thus, as the 40th Army cast about in search of the elusive Mujahideen, a civilian army embarked on its own extensive mission. Moscow held a comparative advantage in terms of Afghanistan expertise, as Tim has chronicled, but not nearly enough personnel in the field for the task. As in the Defiant Border, ideology and the limits of prior knowledge yielded in turn misguided policy. The same could, of course, be said for the Americans as well, whose intellectual reliance on British notions of a primitive, tribalized society precluded consideration of what Afghanistan's post-war future might be, or closer consideration of their wartime allies. Distant from the action, always reliant on Pakistani middlemen, and in the case of President Ronald Reagan, sentimentally invested in the Afghan struggle, US officials clung to the image of a tribal country, overlooking the salience of Islam within the resistance. International actors, meanwhile, pursued expansive agendas in the refugee camps that dotted the Pakistani borderlands. Perhaps the book's finest chapter details the parallel Afghanistan that arose in those camps, where millions of Afghans took up emergency residence. Elizabeth notes the irony that international actors working from a far less expansive vision wrought far more extensive change than their Marxist or Islamist counterparts. For international organizations, the camps provided a site for humanitarianism alongside Western lines, but their everyday administration eroded earlier identities and structures, substituting new ones. In place of traditional notions of Afghan mobility or the Islamic tradition of the muhajir, they substituted a notion of refugee status, conveying helplessness and desperation. The Afghanistan in exile that emerged served as a lingering rebuke to the government in Kabul, but also as a challenge to subsequent efforts to reunite the country. Afghanistan is finished for good, one refugee concluded. Perhaps not, but Elizabeth's book describes the irrevocable internationalization of Afghan politics, the collapse of meaningful borders between the domestic and the international that I think stood relatively stoutly until Daoud's overthrow. It implicates the international community in the ensuing maelstrom. If there is an Afghan exceptionalism, it may be this, as Elizabeth suggested, the willingness of a diverse range of foreign and domestic actors to ascribe extraordinary significance to the country for reasons only occasionally related to the aspirations of everyday Afghans. The willingness of the Brezhnev Politburo to torment itself with bizarre visions of an American missile base springing up across the Amu Darya, or of US policymakers to imagine Soviet tanks clanking their way through the deserts of Baluchistan en route to the Persian Gulf, or for that matter of Pakistan's General Zia to redefine an entire neighboring state as strategic depth at the expense of the aspirations of its people. Afghanistan's plight then and now reveals the conceits and the choices of the world around it. As in the 1980s, the consequences emanate globally, today from the eastern border of Poland to the western shores of Australia. Afghan Crucible powerfully illustrates the perils of treating this country as a special canvas for doctrines and suppositions, or of isolating its history and experiences from those of the world at large. It has been a great pleasure to have an early glimpse of this book, and I exhort all of you to read it when you have the chance. I have a handful of questions and 0 additional comments, which I could throw out, or we could just open this to the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rob, please, we can start with your questions, if that's okay, Elizabeth, and then I can gather questions from the audience in the meantime. So please go ahead.
All right. I would, this might be more of a provocation. I might ask if 1973 should be understood as a point of rupture. Daoud's coup, Daoud's overthrow of the monarchy and the constitutional experiment renewed concerns about Afghan alignment within the Cold War, although not all at once, reinvigorated the Pashtunistan conflict, and also fundamentally shifted the tenor of Afghan politics onto a terrain that favored more violent and conspiratorial actors. So that as in the book, parties that probably represented something closer to the mainstream just simply had a disadvantage next to the Islamists and the Marxists. So might we consider 73 as the hidden point of rupture? This question might appear cruel, but if you had a 10th chapter that considered a different capital, what would it be and why? And also, I'm sure there'd be considerable interest in this, although this question might poach from what I understand to be a later appearance. What would you suggest should be the directions of the historiography of Afghanistan or its international experience in recent years or further back in time? I think if you had a suggestion, if you had a dissertation suggestion, for example, what would it be? And I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Elizabeth, we are still collecting questions, so please go ahead with responding.
Brilliant. I would say, Rob, thanks so much, and also for your very generous description of the book. I feel like, quite frankly, you should be doing the book talk rather than me. I think you were far more coherent. Thank you as well then for these questions. I think they're all really interesting and really provocative. 1973 as a point of rupture is a really interesting question. And it's definitely one I've thought about. I've thought about some. I don't think I've necessarily given it as much thought as I would like to. I don't know, I guess I do see it as a point of, I do see it in some respects as a point of change, but in some respects, I think I probably almost see the period between 1975 and 1976 as a slightly almost more significant moment in terms of dynamics, I suppose, in terms of thinking about Dawood's efforts between 75 and 76 to create this new constitution for Afghanistan, which was really quite radical and ambitious and I think that's really where you see a really very strikingly different political vision of Afghanistan come through. And I think as well, then kind of seeing that alongside kind of these shifts in relations, I suppose, with Pakistan on one hand, as well as then kind of this moment of resistance from the Afghan Islamist groups, as well as then kind of, I guess, increasing tensions between Dawood's government and the Afghan Socialists and other groups as well. But I think 1973 is a really interesting year. 10th chapter. This was something that other people have kind of pushed me on before as well. I mean, certainly I should say one real, I guess, limitation of the book is I don't consider the role of Saudi Arabia very extensively. That's definitely kind of one area that's limited. I would have loved, in a world where I had unlimited time, unlimited research funding, and unlimited opportunities to learn languages, I would have loved to have done more with vernacular sources. I just didn't have the opportunity. I would say, there were a lot of materials at archives, particularly across the US, that I really wanted to draw on, and I just didn't have an opportunity to. But it would have been nice to be able to bring in some more of the on the ground perspectives as well. But it just really wasn't possible. That being said, I think what is so exciting is the fact that there is some really vibrant historiography emerging on Afghanistan, particularly the mid-20th century, as you've said. I was in a workshop a couple of days ago where looking at a paper by Majnun Masumi, and her kind of sonic histories of Afghanistan in the mid-20th century are so exciting to me. And I should say, likewise, I'm really excited to be teaching Marjan Wardaki's new Modern Asian Studies article in a couple of weeks to my undergraduates. So I think there is some really exciting history that's also, I guess, very multi or interdisciplinary as well. But I think, as you say, is really sort of shedding light on the 20th century. I do think kind of Afghanistan's 20th century history, kind of histories of Afghan internationalism in the 20th century too, are so important. And also I think in that respect, then really kind of allow us to see the ways in which Afghan, artists, intellectuals, elites, and communities were very much in dialogue with and engaging with regional as well as international dynamics across that time period, and in a lot of kind of very rich and vibrant, very different ways. So I think that would that would probably be it. But yeah, I guess just one other thing I would probably say is that I think, I guess one of the issues that's sort of interesting or worth reflecting on is the extent to which scholarship on Afghanistan is or does not tend to be quite presentist. And I think the ways that our kind of various current moments have informed study of Afghanistan perhaps has been more potent in the study of Afghanistan than it has in the study of other regions. And I think that's something that a lot of people are pushing, a lot of scholars are pushing back against. And I think very rightly and necessarily so.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we have about 25 minutes or so for Q&A. So questions from the audience?